I have been very intensely involved for 5 or 6 years and was involved before that on our rail systems in Seattle. And I've heard and met some people, some of whom I knew over the internet, and they say, "Oh, you're doing great work out in Seattle." The fact is we have pretty much fundamentally failed up and down the line. Everything we've tried to do, we've not been able to do. We haven't, except just a bit, we haven't been able to change the media. We've lost everything in court. We've not had any impact on the agency other than to take up a little bit of their time as they squash us along the way. We haven't changed the political system. There have been a few people turned out of office, but not the main culprits. And so we have very little to show for it, and I don't know when we will. We know that eventually the system of its own accord is not viable, and so at some point it will stop. But it's already into my great-grandchildren's generation, the payments that we're already committed to make. And so we're 2 generations past me that has already been encumbered by the system that we're trying to build. And so far on the light rail, which is our primary system, we are building the first 14 miles of a 125-mile system. Now, it was all supposed to be done by 2020, and the 14 miles is all that will be done. But the effort is going to proceed. Now, so in thinking about what would I talk about at this session, particularly when we have mainly failures to share, I decided what I'd like most to do, because I think this could be helpful to others, particularly others that may not be at the same, as far along as we are, is to understand how this is working, because we've gained a lot of insight as we've dealt with this into how these systems work. And there's been constant revelations, and things that at the time were not as understandable as they happen become increasingly understandable in retrospect. I'll just mention one. Because I was a participant, I saw years and years ago a poll done by Fairbank, Maslin, Baldwin and Associates about rail transport. It was done in September 1994. And, I looked at that poll at the time, and I read it, and I thought, it's interesting, and some interesting information. And I'd completely forgotten it. And about a year ago, I was going through some old file cabinets looking for something else, and I ran across this poll. Well, reading the poll today, what I realize is the system that was proposed and adopted in 1996 was based on the polls. I mean, it wasn't based on what anything will cost. It wasn't based upon what anything will accomplish. It wasn't based upon how long it'll take to build it. It was based upon the poll. And that insight, I don't think there's any way that I could have realized at the time. But now that we're seeing what's unfolding, you can see that the poll is very, very close to what the proposal was. And reality departs radically. So the title of my paper and my talk is Quack Transportation Planning in America's #1 City. And the #1 city isn't meant just to be facile, bragging about a city that I love but I'm becoming terribly despondent about. But recently, the Conference of Mayors named us this #1 city. And I guess it's because of our mayor, who was instrumental in launching this whole catastrophe, which without question is the most cataclysmic, disastrous event in the history of Seattle in scale. It's certainly a bigger catastrophe than the Seattle fire, which burnt the downtown. And the amount of fraud exceeds that of WorldCom, whose head was convicted and could be sentenced for up to 85 years, except because that's a publicly traded private company. There are sanctions that aren't imposed upon people who are violating the public trust. But but trying to understand what is going on, again, another quote that I first saw years ago, but over time has come to be centrally profound. And it's Charles Lav from the University of California, Irvine, and he had this to say, and he's talking about Tom's system in Los Angeles. What we had was an odd marriage between idealistic planners and cynical profiteers. The idealists wanted to improve Los Angeles. They perceived cars as a problem and were so determined to cure the problem that they talked themselves into believing it could be done. The profiteers are the engineering companies that go around the country pandering to the idealists. These companies know that new rail systems cannot lure people out of cars. No rail system built over the last 20 years has done so, but like cancer quacks, consistent failures do not bother them. They know there is money to be made by peddling hope. And what we have is a combination, and they need both sides, of the most opportunistic, exploitive, fraudulent exercise of people who stand to make money on it, to get campaign contributions, to keep themselves in power, on the one hand, and who know what they're doing and are terribly skillful at it, and people who, and many of them are from the environmental community that I regard myself as being from, and the good government community, people who I think many or most of whom want the best for their community, and they believe this. And I think the quackery aspect is probably as good as one can find, because they imagine problems, and this is a miracle cure, and they're resistant to look at any evidence. Although the difference with the medical community is we tend to have some constraints of profession, or from the National Institute of Health or the medical community, and in this case, the profession is part of the conspiracy of peddling hope and selling quackery and in effect exploiting the public. Now, one document that I have there is called Report Card on Sound Transit, and myself and some others put a lot of effort into that. We're on a 10-year plan, putatively. It's now become a completely open-ended plan, but it's a 10-year plan. That's what was sold, and we've completed 8 years, and so this report card reflects the status at 8 years of the 10-year plan. The rail systems earn an F, and this is based upon simple calculations of what they said in terms of the construction schedule, the capital cost, the operating cost, the ridership benefit. And Sound Transit has not disputed any of the information in this report. The only thing they've disputed is, well, there's lots of other wonderful things that they're doing that this doesn't acknowledge. But this represents that, and Tom took issue with by giving a C grade to Tacoma Link, which is a really absurd 1.6 mile trolley that each boarding costs $5.30 and then there's free parking besides. But I tried to patiently explain to him that I'm just basing this report on what Sound Transit promised, and the trolley, has some measure of performance, like they finished it, something not far off schedule, for example, and the ridership, because they run it free, which was not the original plan, the ridership has actually been exceeded. But to give you some idea of how bad this is, when Sound Transit did not, another fellow and I commissioned the Northwest's leading economic consulting firm, Eco Northwest, to do an economic analysis of the proposal in 1996. And their conclusion was that the net current value of the $3.9 billion proposal is minus $2.5 billion. So in short, this report could have an A for every one of them and be a tremendous waste of money. So you can just take consideration of that when a grade is a C or an F. This starts from a very, very low beginning point to reach that. And just to tick off a few numbers, and then I don't want to take much time on the report card, but like the light rail was supposed to be completed next year for $2.3 billion. The cheap part of it will be completed if it makes this schedule, the current schedule. The cheap part of it will be completed 3 years later for more money than the whole thing was supposed to cost. If we achieved that ridership projection, which is very implausible, if it did, it would be 1/3 the ridership benefit promised. And as for the scale of riders, we have very low expectations, but in the report I said we really can't judge it. All we really know is the other things aren't working out. The commuter rail currently is projected at $1.23 billion, which is a 90% cost overrun. It's in its 5th year of operation, and it has 1/3 the promised ridership. The operating cost per boarding last year was $19.40. It's getting worse year to year. We may come to a point where a corner is turned, but they promised operation economies of scale, and starting 2002, each year the operating cost has gotten worse. The fare box recovery has gotten worse from year to year. And if you annualize the capital cost, in 2004 it was $100 per boarding, which means that each round-trip commuter for the year costs $60,000. And so, you know, and in this case, I don't make a point of this very often because I know he wouldn't back me up. But I finally had dinner with our Washington State, the Secretary of the Washington State Department of Transportation, who, by the way, is a protege of Frederick Salvucci, the father of the Big Dig. And we disagreed on most things, but somehow in the course of this dinner conversation, he volunteered that Sounder commuter rail was a terrible waste, a terrible investment. And I said, well, then why do we keep doing it? And in fact, it was 2 months after this that there was approved by the Sound Transit Board, including him, the most wasteful segment of it that's about twice as bad as the whole system that I just described. I said, well, why do we keep doing it? And he shrugs and he says, geopolitical realities. So that's, I mean, I guess it's campaign contributions and being able to reward your friends. Which brings to mind that I have a colleague, and for a while I didn't accept, well, I mean, I thought it was interesting, but I didn't embrace a phrase that she coined, but now I think I've totally signed on to it, which is maybe the subtitle of this talk. And in fact, she was a elected politician, an avid transit promoter, and I thought she was absolutely hopeless. She was so much for this, but she was somebody who got her eyes open, and as events started kind of unfolding, Miss Maggie, that she completely, you know, did a turnaround. But her slogan is, the cost is the benefit. That's what the benefit is. The benefit of this system is the cost. Because if you want to make money, if you want to control money, if you want to have favors to dish out, if you want to enrich yourself, if you want to have power and influence and have constituency support, the more the money is, the more the money, the better. And that's the core of this whole goddamn system.
It really has nothing to do with moving passengers.
No, because you know, this I was going to mention at the end, but here's an example of where we are right now. They want now phase 2, which is to double the taxes, and they want to put rail across Lake Washington on I-90 and into the East King County, because that part, which is the only part that's sort of working, is being served only by buses today. And 520 bridge because it's more easy. But so in this model, the buses would all have to go across for comparative purposes, the I-90. And they say this is so they can compare apples to apples. The lane has to be an exclusive transit lane. Again, apples to apples. Whereas one bus per line, one bus per minute, basically a mile apart, would equal the seated capacity, maximum capacity of the train. And so you could have thousands of people per hour in carpools, van pools, restricted access lane, But no, it's got to be, apples to apples. It's got to be an exclusive blade, and that's part of the rules of the consideration. And they've already been caught red-handed with adding $2 billion to the cost of the bus. That just isn't true at all. One of it is by finagling the value of money. In other words, they took an inflated value of the money to the tune of 10 digits. And only in this instance, they were absolutely caught red-handed, and they said it was an honest mistake. Although their honest mistakes always go in one direction. But one of the things that is, then the final thing, they say it's faster to go on the train. And the way they do that is they assume that they're going to have a train running north. That's the no-build alternative, although they need $5 billion to do it, but they don't have it because everything's on the budget. And that so you'd have to take a bus across I-90 and transfer the train, which would mean it takes longer. But for example, you could go to the University of Washington today in under a third the time by a bus that's served today. I mean, if you're going from Bellevue, you just get on, go across the 540 bridge. You go to Northgate in less than half the time. But in their calculations, it's the other way. But it takes longer. And this is sort of the way the whole system works. And I don't know if they'll get by the next one or not. Now, why is rail so costly in Seattle? I mean, one of the things you need to know about our city is that we are building, the top of the line, expensive rail projects. The cheap portion, I said, is the only portion we can currently start, is $175 million a mile. It starts getting expensive after that. That's the cheap part. The next part, which involves a lot of tunnel, is over $350 million a mile. And so then it starts getting expensive. And the fact is, of course, we have high labor costs. I think we have an incompetent agency, so that contributes to the cost. But the fact is, Seattle is about as poor a place that you can find to do this sort of thing. Now, if you're out on a prairie, there's some possibility there. Availability of land, things are flat, maybe we have a lot of rivers. I mean, we've got waters hemming us in, we've got rivers we've got to cross or go under, we have hills, we have glacial soils that are unstable. Earthquake, we have high earthquake hazards. Just about a week or so ago, it hasn't even hit the news, Sound Transit tipped off, the staff had to tip off the board that where they're starting to build the Beacon Hill station, they're going to have to move the station a little bit because it turns out the soil doesn't work right there. And so they have to move it about 30 feet to make this work. So we're just the worst place, but we believe in rail so much that doesn't matter. And as I say, in some ways it's an advantage because it just costs more that way.
It's the good Lord has made it a great challenge.
Yeah, that's right, and it just has a lot more work that has to be done. Now, I want to just give a rundown again, partly because we've learned this over time, and I suspect that this is the same kind of thing that happens in other jurisdictions, and it's useful to know them as they happen, or ideally before they happen. But this has to do with the willful mendacity. I'm sure a lot of you people have read the literature of like Ben Flyberg and his colleagues, or years ago Don Pickrell, about the way in which these costs are consistently understated and the benefits are overstated, and they've even sometimes been as direct as saying they lie, and other times they say they engage in strategic misrepresentation, which is that you do what you need to do to get the money. But I want to give a quote that came from a person who participated in the process in our so-called expert review panel, and he was embarrassed by this quote, but he made it at a symposium at Portland, I said PLU in this paper, but it's Portland State University, PSU. And clearly he didn't intend anybody from Seattle to hear it. And one of our guys was going through, the web, and he found this, and it had streaming media, and he was able to get this quote, as I say, which embarrassed Professor Rutherford. But here's what he said. And of course, this you do the same thing to get the vote, which is even worth more. But he said this: you had to get a certain cost effectiveness to be able to get funded, or at least to get recommended for funding by the Federal Transportation Administration. So if you weren't doing your trips for $6 a trip, this is an old number, then you couldn't get funding. So the game was, if you could keep your cost estimate down and your rider forecast up, they were looking at this cost effectiveness number, cost per new rider, and those costs can get way out of line. And so the federal government is saying, well, we don't want to invest in something that has, $30 per new rider, which boy, I'll tell you this, that sounds really good. But anyway, so what people did was sort of lowballed their cost estimates and goosed their forecasts so that number comes down to sort of under $10. I always thought that when I was out there watching this, that, someone's going to go to jail. These people are robbing the federal government of $1 billion. They're defrauding the federal government, basically. I mean, what else could you say? They're cheating. But the thing was that if you didn't cheat, you got nothing, and if you cheated, you might get $1 billion. So what do you think people do? I mean, duh. And this is what we're engaged in. Now, then there was an insight in this way. Sound Transit is obliged to have an independent annual comprehensive audit. I said annual, every year. And they've never done it. And nobody makes them do it, nobody demands they do it, nobody editorializes that they do it, and they just don't ever do it. But they, at one brief point, commissioned a little tiny study, and this is when they were terribly embarrassed because they'd been saying they didn't have any cost overruns, and then they admitted that, well, we just discovered a $1.5 billion cost overrun for this $2.3 billion system. And so then they decided that they would commission this little study, and it wasn't even exactly independent because they gave the contract to their own auditing firm, Deloitte and Touche, but I think that the guys who did it were probably pretty capable. And they didn't give them very much money, and it had to be done real fast, and it was a fairly arcane subject, which is look and see if there's anything the matter with our cost estimating methodology that would help explain why these numbers have been so far off. Well, these guys came back, and again, the press did nothing with them. These guys came back, and here is what they are, ticked off on a PowerPoint presentation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First, development of estimates to match a budget. I mean, the first reason why the costs aren't right is you started with the goddamn budget. And then you just make your estimates work what you want them to be. And this I say is, I think, added ammunition for the fact that the budget came from the polls. Second, overly optimistic estimates. Third, inadequate contingencies. Fourth, contingencies prematurely reduced. Fifth, inadequate, insufficient data. And sixth, inadequate soft costs. And then they go on to say, the estimates were developed with too much optimism for the best case scenario to occur in all cases. Estimates were prematurely reduced at the direction of Sound Transit Management. The agency estimates were lowered in 1999 based upon overly optimistic staffing plans, and the project schedule was based upon a completion date in the fall of 2006, which was completely unrealistic. I mean, this is why the estimates aren't right, I mean, so it shouldn't be any surprise. And we had called a little earlier, 88 of us, for an independent audit because we knew that they were over budget. I mean, from what you could find. And FTA knew that they were over budget, but they're part of the same deal. And they immediately had a press release, said they'd been audited to death, there were no cost overruns, and we were liars. And when these amounts were acknowledged, they then had a press conference, because they had to deal with this, and then they did a Q&A with some Seattle Times reporters, and here's one that I think is really precious, and that is, they said, okay, but now we've got it right, and we can promise you that there'll be no more surprises. And I think that the answer to this next question was very revealing. The answer was, well, how come you can promise us there will be no more surprises? Can we count on these figures being accurate? Here's why we can count on these figures being accurate. Now, as it turned out, they weren't either. But The Sound Transit staff members insist the budget released last week is realistic. They say they failed to total everything up and look at the bottom line, and they promise no sort of surprise. The new budget has, adequate contingency funds. In other words, all this auditing, being audited to death, they forgot to add the numbers up and look at the bottom line. So that would help explain why they were so far off. Now, if you can imagine gullible ones. And then, in our case, I say that I think maybe even the most damning evidence of willful fraud, and this is the one that's really costing us, is that we had this plan, and this is what the citizens were told, and I didn't think it was a good plan, but it was sold effectively, and they had a lot of money, and so it was going to accomplish all these things, and it was going to cost this much, and these were conservative estimates, very conservative estimates, conspicuously conservative estimates, et cetera, and so forth, and so on. We've had these checked and double-checked and backed up, and that we will make certain this is built on time and on budget, and there's going to be these many riders, and you count on it, it's probably going to be a lot more than that, and et cetera, and so forth, and so on. It goes on at length. And there even had to be, by state statute, an 8-page tabloid sent to every household so that people know what they're going to vote on, and the sorts of things I'm describing for this 10-year plan were all described on this. And in the summer before the ballot issue, Sound Transit's board passed an item called Resolution 75. Nobody ever reported on it. There's no way that one person in 1,000 knew it existed. And if 1 in 10,000 knew it existed, they wouldn't have known what was in it. And Section 2 sort of says that, well, then if things don't work out just like we hope they will, well, we're just free to do our best. And this now, confirmed by the Washington State Supreme Court, means, well, I'll give the quote of what it means because Sound Transit is the one who said it in open court. Sound Transit, it claimed, and it's been confirmed, has the power to collect taxes for as many years as necessary without a spending limit to complete their entire light rail line voters approved in 1996. Now, I think the fact is that if they don't get more money, which they're seeking and seeking and seeking, they'll never be able to complete it. Because the cost, and then the cost of the bonds, and then the cost as you wait, is probably more than they can do with them. In fact, now what they want to do is they want to double their taxes for what they call Phase 2, a good part of which is to do Phase 1, the one that we already paid for. But they now, and this is the sense in which I submit this is a scam that surpasses WorldCom. WorldCom was about 11 billion. This will be, they're now calculating how much will they collect, and these are in constant dollars, how much will they collect as of 2030? And that's 17 billion for a $3.9 billion package of projects. And then they will be committing for 30 years beyond that for a bond schedule that will have to be repaid, which will be something up toward, in the shouting distance of double that. And so we're talking about a lot of money. Now, I want to mention one other final footnote about the evidence of fraud, and that is Parsons Brinkerhoff plays the same role with us that they did in the Big Dig. And so reading the Massachusetts Inspector General's report was really a revelation for me. And if you haven't read about the history of the Big Dig project and the finances of it, it was a 2002 report, but it was, well, let me just read one. In fact, this may even be the culminating paragraph of that report by the Massachusetts Inspector General. Big Dig officials would never have been able to perpetrate the inaccurate presentation of such detailed cost information without the active collaboration of Bechtel and Parsons Brinkerhoff. Bechtel was the partner of Parsons Brinkerhoff in this. The entity that gathered, controlled, and manipulated all big data cost data. Bechtel, Parsons Brinkerhoff did not participate passively. They took control soon after Big Dig officials decided to obscure the true costs. And if anybody doesn't know this, just to nail this down, a very courageous professional from Bechtel in 1993 said, we've got to get a handle on what these costs are. And he put together a team, a high-powered team of 30 people, some of them were Parsons Brinckerhoff, and they scrubbed the numbers. And they came out with a figure in the beginning of 1994 that was within 3% of what the figure was calculated to be 7 years later. And it was beyond $14 billion. And the response of the agency was, get that guy out of here and get us somebody who will play ball. And to their credit, this is no credit to Parsons Brinckerhoff, they played not a constructive role at all. And at this point it was being represented at $6 billion, or was it 8? I can't remember whether, I think it was $6 billion, but it was either 6 or 8 billion. That was, and that's what they wanted to stick with. And so that's what they had to do. And in the same report, it has 5 pages, 3 columns of 218 itemized ways in which they manipulated the costs, Parsons Brinckerhoff and Bechtel, to understate them. And to bondholders, and to the legislature, and to the citizens of Massachusetts. And that's what we have going on in Seattle. And I think Parsons Brinckerhoff is speaking correctly when they say, we didn't make up the original numbers, and I think that's true. They're just the ones who helped manipulate and obscure and hide them. But they just did what the numbers came from, I think, from the polling. Sound Transit put together the original numbers, and they just do what it takes to profess those. Now, I think my penultimate point is the way in which this pernicious behavior then is emulated all over. I mean, I think FTA helps. I think the American Transit Association helps. But these agencies help each other, and I have one provincial example because I'm here in Minneapolis, and that is it sent me from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, written by Emory Blake, the reporter, and it's headlined, "Here's How Commuter Rail is Doing in Seattle." And the head of Sound Transit Sounder Commuter Rail was here, recruited by the North Star advocates to speak to the legislators here. And the lead sentence of the story, and it's doing great according to the story, the lead sentence of the story is 8 of every 10 riders on the new Seattle Sounder commuter rail line are commuters who formerly drove to work. Now, this isn't necessarily the most serious or most fraudulent thing, but this one was one that sort of interested us because we'd never heard anything like that, and we thought that was implausible. So a colleague went down to Sound Transit, and he said, what are the I'd like to see the surveys you've done on the ridership and how many are transfers, who were formerly not transit patrons. And they said, we don't have any surveys like that. I said, well, you don't know what they are? No, we don't have any idea. I said, well, then how come Paul Price told the Minneapolis legislators that? Said, no, he didn't have any. They completely disavowed that. They said, well, he didn't have any basis to say that. And so then when he was asked, he said, the reporter must have made that up. And but then there were a lot of other things about just how great this system is, how fast it's growing, how well it's doing, how wonderful it would be, and you ought to do the same thing right here. Well, then let me tell you one other interesting thing. This story was printed in the second week of April 2001. At the end of that month, and of course this was going on at the time he was saying this, at the end of the month, one of the few good pieces of investigative research that's been done on Sound Transit in Seattle was done by a Seattle Times reporter, and it was this, that Sound Transit had ordered 11 locomotives and 75 coaches for its Sounder trains so we could be providing service. It was provided, as of this particular date in the plan. Except there wasn't going to be anybody hardly to ride them. And so before we even took delivery of them, we were madly rushing around and managed to lease or persuade the manufacturers not to give us and give them to somebody else 47 of the 75 coaches and 4 of the 11 locomotives. Before, and this was happening while all this bullshit is being said to the legislatures here in Minneapolis simultaneously. And in fact, I'll tell you that we are now 4 years later, and of the remnant of coaches and locomotives, we've still got rolling stock that we've never had any need for. And I mean, the day may come when we do, but we still don't. And this is the discrepancy between what is said and what the reality is. And although I don't know for sure whether she ever did anything, I took the trouble to write Lori Blake and tell her about this and tell her where she could get the information. I sent her the story from the Seattle Times, etc. and so forth and so on, and told her what the original source is. She doesn't have to believe me, but here's where you can check it all out. I never got an acknowledgement, and my suspicion is, because it's what we have to deal with all the time in Seattle, my suspicion is, to the extent that an informed person in Minneapolis has any sense of what's going on, what they believe is the original story. How great Sounder is doing in Seattle, and it's a reason why you ought to do the same thing here in Minneapolis.
I can address that. Lori Blake mostly writes articles based on Met Council press releases, and secondly, the Star Tribune that she writes for wrote an article a while back, editorial a while back, that said real cities have trains.
Yeah, well, as I say, that's what I expect because it's what we do. And so as I say, I don't come here with any hope. I'm stopping right now. I don't come here with, I mean, you know, and I'm just absolutely despondent. And we've a place that we used to pride ourselves on having a good government. Now basically, the people who hold positions of power, particularly in Central Puget Sound, are Sound Transit's people. And it's very difficult to challenge them because of all the money and constituency interest and the lack of media coverage of what's going on. And so it's not a reason to give up, but it sure is a tough go. And as I say, this will collapse, just as Whoops collapsed a generation ago, because it's ultimately non-viable. The question is, how terrible will the damage be, and how far will it go by that time? And as I say, we're beyond WorldCom in terms of what we're inflicting on ourselves.